Welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technology, and ideas shaping a sustainable and profitable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today we're celebrating our 1-year anniversary of our podcast. AgCulture Podcast is now aired every single week for an entire year. Actually, by the time this episode is released, we'll be over that. I'm a little behind on getting this recorded, but I'm really excited about hitting this milestone. I wasn't really sure if I was going to be able to achieve it when I first set out a year ago. I didn't know what this was going to look like. It's been quite the journey in the last year, and I just want to say thank you, first of all, to our audience, to you, the listeners. You've been very encouraging to me along the way, and I've just been blown away by the response we've gotten from this podcast. I didn't expect this many people to listen to it. Right now, I don't know if I should say this or not, but right now we're right around 100,000 listens, maybe a little bit over that at this point, which was not what I was expecting. I was hoping a few thousand people would be able to listen to this and get something out of it. So thank you so much for the huge support. Especially, we really didn't do any advertising. This has just been all organic growth because you guys, the listeners, have been sharing this with other people and been very engaging in the community that we've built through the social media channels that we're on. And just want to say thank you for that. Hey, everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I just wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Bank Barn. I love these guys and what they're doing to streamline banking in agriculture. They're helping to connect farmers and lenders so that today's farmers have more options no matter the size of operation. Check out bankbarn.io to learn more. So in this episode, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just doing a recap of what this year looked like with the podcast and really starting out with that. I want to be candid of why I started the podcast. Many of you have probably heard me talk about my scholarship experience with Nuffield International Farming Scholarship that I've gotten. And that started about a year ago now. And I've been on that journey. It's taken me all over the world. And that was really probably the biggest catalyst for starting this podcast. I had several other people that encouraged me along the way that I should start a podcast with all the interesting things that I get involved with in agriculture. And they were really excited to hear the stories that I told them personally. And they wanted me to share that. So that was really the catalyst that started AgCulture Podcast. Something that I was excited to do, but to be honest with you, I didn't think I was the type of person that could to do an engaging podcast. And those of you that have probably listened to the first couple episodes, you probably would agree with me. But now I feel like I'm starting to get my feet under me and being able to ask engaging questions of the guests that we have on. And I've just been blown away by the quality of guests that have been on this podcast. That's what's really made this podcast. And it really just boils down to, being curious and asking great people that I respect to be a part of this. So I've heard from many of you that you've been learning a lot of things on the podcast, hearing about different sectors that you might not have been involved in yourself, farming or in an agribusiness. And that's really been interesting to me as well, to hear from so many different sectors of agriculture in this past year. I feel like I've grown personally so much through that and learned through experiences that other sectors have that I may not have experienced in mine. So that's been great. And also, there's just been so many doors opened to me personally through this podcast, and it's been a great impact in my life. And you can check out the social media pages that we have to see some of those things that have occurred this year in my personal life because of this podcast. Now, one of the interesting things that I've had happen to me through this year is I've had people on the podcast, and then not very long after that, I would be in their area of the world or at a conference that they were at or something where I got to meet them in person. And that's been really neat to build a connection first through this podcast, having that background information of their story and their insights in their specific sector, and then being able to just hang out with them in person and get to know them better, and being invited to stay with them in a few different places as well. That's been really great, and I want to say thank you to the guests that have offered that and have been a part of that journey through this year. Now, the other cool part is when I hear from people that have listened that, hey, I've connected with this guest that you had on the other day and had a great conversation with them, or they brought me this insight, or they helped connect me to this person. That was really the outcome that I was hoping to get from this podcast. You know, I said I started it originally to document my journeys as a Nuffield Scholar and some of the conversations that I've had along the way. But I really wanted it to be a catalyst for building connections across different sectors and different geographies in agriculture around the world. And that's starting to happen. It's really cool to hear those stories. So if you have a story like that, please share it with me. I love hearing that. That's a big encouragement for me to keep going with this project of the podcast. And also hearing of how people have listened to something they heard on the podcast and then implemented it in their business or looked into it more for themselves. That's been great to hear the impact that we've been having on people's lives and their businesses and farms. So many of you are probably dying to know what's been the most popular episode. It's probably not very surprising. It's been episode 28 with Gabe Brown. For those of you that know Gabe, he's a very popular guy and very well known around the world as one of the big gurus or founders of the regenerative agriculture movement, especially here in the US, but around the world as well. So that's been our most popular episode. But it's really interesting to hear how there's every time I talk to somebody that listens to the podcast, their favorite episode is different than the next person's. And to me, that really means that we're having a great mix of people to keep you guys engaged and keep you being curious about what's up next on the podcast. So I just wanted to do a quick recap of the vast array of people that we've had on the podcast, where they're from, number one. So starting out this year, I was in the UAE and Dubai, and then also in Bahrain on that same trip. And that was back in February. And you would have seen a couple of guests that I had on from Dairy Farmers of America and Mana Agro that is based in Dubai. And I was able to tour the Arla factory that was in Bahrain as part of that trip. Then the next trip consisted of a whole bunch of countries. We started out in Brazil, had several episodes with that. That was in March. And then in April, was in Texas with my Nuffield group. And then we went to Germany and Ireland after that, Northern Ireland and then Ireland. So that was this spring. And then then I was in Canada for the IFMA conference in July. And in between that, we had some guests on from Australia. Earlier on, we had one from Colombia for the Green Coffee Company, based in Colombia. Then we also had some guests from Sweden as well. And then in the fall, I was able to take a trip to Europe for about a month, where we hit up the Netherlands, the UK, all around the UK, back to Ireland, Sweden, and Denmark. And we also had a couple of Kiwi or New Zealanders in there in the meantime as well. So we've had many, many countries represented and many sectors of agriculture, from coffee to beef to dairy, greenhouse, fruits, vegetables, across the board. Even fly farming That's my friend from Nuffield, David Taverner, who's the fly farmer from the UK. That was actually a pretty popular episode. Very interesting to see his operation, what he's doing with that. So that's just a recap. That took me 45 flights and many, many, many hours in vehicles running around different continents to achieve that. So that was a lot of traveling this year, and there'll be more to come in 2025. I will be in New Zealand as well as most likely Australia on that same trip earlier in the year. And then right now, I also have booked to go down back to South America. I'll for sure at least be in Chile, and I'm hoping to hit up a couple other South American countries while I'm down there as well. So that'll be more toward the second half of the year. And I'm sure we'll be hitting up some people in different countries that are going to be guests on here as well. So I want to hear from you guys. Is there a place in the world that you'd be interested in hearing about agriculture from, or a sector maybe that we haven't really touched on yet that you'd be interested in hearing about? We're going to try and do some more unique things with some ag tech companies, probably looking into the forestry area as well, and just a few other sectors that we haven't had on here yet. Now, I want to go into really the two big things that I took away from my experience with the podcast this year, other than personally growing and being able to have a recording that sounded halfway decent and me understanding how to ask better questions. That was a big skill set that I've hopefully been learning well over the last year here. But the two big learnings I had, number one, and a lot of this came from my travels, my personal travels, but still as well from recordings and asking engaging questions on the podcast here. But that would be to make sure you hear both sides of a story and don't jump to conclusions or judge somebody right away based off of them having different viewpoint than you. So I think it's really good to have your own convictions as a foundation for understanding the world around you. But it's also important to still make sure that you understand the viewpoints of others that are different from yours, and also how they arrived at those conclusions. That will really tell you a lot about how they think. Now, that could be through different lenses of culture, religion, geography, even historical context, and how they farm. So those are things that you really need to take into account as you're looking at somebody that has a different perspective or viewpoint from you. Just to give you an example, I think we talked about it on the episode with World Without Cows. That was not too long ago here, about a month ago. The example of a cow, what a cow is in the US is very different to what a cow is in India. And that revolves more around the culture and religion. So that's something that you need to take into account when you're trying to have a discussion around cows and how you manage cows and how the market perceives what you're doing and what products you have. Also, the geography context. So I'm in Michigan. That's where my farm is. We're surrounded by 20% of the world's fresh surface water. And we have large aquifers as well underneath Michigan. We've got a lot of water. We've got great water. Some areas, the groundwater isn't phenomenal in Michigan, but by and large, Michigan is known for water. Now, I was in the UAE outside of Dubai at a dairy farm in the middle of the desert. I've been on some dairies this year in Arizona that are in the middle of the desert. That's a very different story. Water is has a very different priority on a farm, especially a dairy farm in a desert versus Michigan. I mean, it's extremely critical for my farm here in Michigan, but it's also, it's not something that I usually have to think about every day unless a drinker goes out or the well shuts down or something like that. But to somebody in the desert, water is probably one of the top things that they are concerned about and deal with on a regular basis. So that really shapes how they think and how they operate. So I just wanted to give those as a couple of examples of some of the things that I've seen along the way. Many, many other examples that I could give, but those are just two really simple ones. But the other thing about all of these different contexts that we look at in agriculture is to me, that's exciting because it shows the diversity in agriculture. It's such a diverse industry with so many different sectors. And we've looked at a lot of these over the last year on the podcast, and not only different sectors, but also different business models, different farm models. Is it a commodity driven business model? Is it a value added driven business model? Is it a niche type business model where you're really selling a story or a brand or a patent type product? We talked about that with the episode with Hamish Gow and the kiwi fruit industry in New Zealand. So there's just so many different business models and sectors that I think this is a great, exciting place to be. And I want to continue to highlight that on the podcast here in the upcoming year in 2025. That's my first big takeaway, making sure you hear both sides of the story. So my second big takeaway is people in agriculture are very giving and happy to share their knowledge. And that's not true in every industry. Actually, probably most industries, that's not true. And I've just been blown away by the people that we've had on this podcast, because a lot of them I didn't know before I did an interview with them. It was a cold reach out where I said, "Hey, would you like to be on my podcast? I think you have a lot of good perspective to bring and have an interesting story." And I've been very, very rarely been turned down by just reaching out to somebody and asking. Now, to say if you are able to help connect me with somebody that would make a great guest, I would love a warm introduction. That would be very helpful. But I've just been blown away by the caliber of people that I've just been able to contact and say, "Hey, please consider being on my podcast." And they gladly do it and have great conversations and are willing to share their knowledge with us at no cost. So that's been really a big insight to me is how special of an industry that we're involved in, that people are willing to give of their time so freely to help others. So 2025, it's coming up very shortly here, and I'm committing to do one more year of this podcast. I didn't think I was going to make it past a year when I originally started this, but here we are. We're a year in, and we've got many guests lined up, and I'm excited for it. I hope you are too. Again, some of the things that we're going to look at, hopefully some stuff in Chile, some interesting stories coming out of New Zealand, some new ag tech companies that I'll be talking with to learn more about for their technology for my Nuffield topic. And again, I would like you to send us any ideas or guests that you have that would make a great story or an insightful episode on a new sector or something that we haven't touched on before. So to wrap up this episode, just a couple of quick asks. Sign up for our LinkedIn newsletter. If you're on LinkedIn, that is a great place to keep up with the information that we're putting out. Also, if you're not on LinkedIn, you can go to our website, agculturepodcast.com, and sign up for our newsletter there. And we've got quite a few people that have signed up for that, and that's been very successful. So thank you for doing that if you've already done that. Another thing, we're looking for a few potential sponsors, partners in this upcoming year that are passionate about entrepreneurship and continuous learning in agriculture. Really ones that want to support our mission, not just do a sales ad. I'm very passionate about what we're doing here and want to keep it as more of a conversation and not something to just sell people on. So if you know somebody or a company that would be interested in investing in what we're doing, please pass them on to us or give our information to them. That would be great. I'd really appreciate that. So far, a lot of this cost of this podcast has been out of my own pocket. Most of it has, but I really think it's been a worthwhile investment over this past year. And I would really love it if anyone else would love to come along on the journey and help invest in this with me. All right. Well, thanks again for listening to the AgCulture Podcast and for being here over the past year. I really appreciate your support and encouragement. Hopefully what we do here has been insightful to you and encouraging to you in your business and career as well. So if you've enjoyed today's episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe and leave a rating and review. If you'd be so kind to do that, that'd be great. Also, if you could share our podcast with others that you know, that's how we get connected, and you can help support our mission through that. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Paul Windemuller, and we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast.